Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to day 2 of Zero Conference. We are starting this morning at 10:05 with our workshop on accessibility policies and standards in the EU. Not the typical topic for interaction in workshops mode, I would say, typically the boring topic. But I promise you, as our host today, myself and Fernando will try to do everything to bring you some new knowledge, amuse you, and interact with you in all the possible ways. So fasten your seatbelts if you are even here or online, and the fun will start. My name is Ivana, and I am working as the head of projects at ESPD, which is the European Platform of Service Providers in Europe. We are part of the Accessible EU projects, which was presented yesterday as well in plenary. There was a couple of hours talking about that. And today, this morning, we are offering workshops on the actual items that we deliver with this project, which is actually a flagship initiative of the Commission related to the Accessibility Act. But on that, I will tell you in a bit. I am a white woman with a very strong Balkan accent or a very typical Slavic accent. I have dark hair, big glasses, and I'm wearing a white jumper. And today with me, my co-host Fernando. I will allow him to introduce himself.
Thanks a lot. I'm Fernando Machicado. I work at UNE. UNE is the National Standards Organization of Spain. I'm one of the core senior experts of Accessible EU, the one regarding standardization. And at the European standards level, I'm the secretary of the technical committees that are developing the standard on accessible ICT, the revision, and the revision of the standard on accessible built environment. I may also in other forums, but not with the secretariat, role of secretariat. So welcome to this workshop. Please register using the QR that you have here, because it's really important for you who are online. Also, please register. It's really important for the European Commission for the sake of transparency, and you will receive an attendance certificate. And I give the floor again to Ivana.
I'll just maybe quickly share what you can expect from this hour and a half. So we will give you a brief overview again of the Accessible EU project. We'll start with that just to make sure that we are all on the same page. Then we'll do a brief overview of the actual key policies and legislation in EU when it comes to accessibility. We also have prepared some interactive presentations for you. Actually interactive ways to do discussion via Menti. Some of you might have used it, but we'll get there in a bit. And after that, we'll as well do a presentation of the key concepts and trends in standardization. All very fancy words, but we'll promise to break them down for a very practical use. We will use today some ICT tools to have a bit of discussion, because we also have some questions for you to understand what is happening in your levels of activities, in your levels of expertise and countries where you come from. And at the end, we will have as well a space for an open discussion for everyone, where we can also ask more questions, share about your experiences. And we, as an outcome of this workshop, we will as well come up with some specific recommendations that are related to accessibility and standardization. So, as I said, it's a lot of fun. When you have a Balkan and Spanish person, the fun is, at least if nothing else, guaranteed. So we are about to live up to that concept. I pass the floor again, Fernando, to you for an overview of Accessible EU.
Thanks a lot. And in the meantime, I will describe myself. Sorry, I forgot about that. I'm a middle-aged man with white beard and long hair, today in a ponytail, and that's all. I'm with glasses. So first of all, a very short hint of Accessible EU, because most of you were yesterday at the Accessible EU session, so I don't want to bore you. Just to tell you that Accessible EU is a flagship initiative of the European Commission. It's mainly a knowledge hub where we have a big network of experts First of all, it's a consortium under the European Commission, led by Fundación 11, and the other partners are EASPD, sorry, I always fail with this, the European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disability. Ivana is part of EASPD. INAT for Accessible Tourism, JKU, the Johannes Kepler University Linz, and UNE, my association. We have also some subcontracting associations, key partners, EDF, the European Disability Forum, and Digital Europe, and AIDS Platform Europe. So as you can see, users and persons with disabilities and other persons are at the core of this project. And we also have Deloitte, Unisys, and Pomilio Bloom helping us with the different projects. We have a big network of experts. To summarize, we have at least one expert per country. In some bigger countries, we have 2 experts, and in bigger countries and with more activity, we will have 3 national experts. And these are our key value. These experts that organize meetings, dissemination, and the idea of this project is trying to create a network of experts at national level and then at European level to help us to implement the European Accessibility Act. We also have an advisory board with Fraunhofer, the International Association of Public Transport, Digital Europe, Design for All Europe, the Center of Excellence in Universal Design of Ireland, the European Certification and Qualification Association, the ESSL Foundation, the Council of European Professional Informatics Societies, David Kaposi, who was the former US Access Board Chair, Director, and the IAIP, and I see Susanna there. It's the chair of the European chapter. Is it okay? Yes. More or less. Fairly. What are we doing? As I said before, most important, we are a knowledge hub and want to raise debate and activities and educate and training on the different factors. And to warm up with these interactive activities, I will let you to use your laptop or your mobile phone and enter menti.com. If you have a mobile phone, you can scan the QR code. If you don't have a mobile phone or you are not able to see the QR code, if you enter it at menti.com, you can use the code 33378893. 33378893. This is a warm-up. We will do 3 series of mentees. This is the first one, only for warm-up. You're going to be asked. 1 second. Let me share the other screen. No, because I have to open it. Sorry. It should be working now. Is it working? Yes, Austria. So many people from the hosting country. For Ukraine.
So maybe for the ones that are joining directly via menti.com, use there is a different code I see now, so sorry for that. It's a technical thing. The code is actually 8953 0797.
Yes.
So 8953 0797. If you're joining directly on menti.com, use the code 8953 0797. And we have from
most of you from Austria, Luxembourg, Ukraine, Lithuania, Slovenia, Finland, United States. Wow, quite far away. Finland. Okay, I think that we keep it. We have some diversity, which is the important point here. Thanks a lot. And now I'll give the floor again to Ivana. 1 second. I need to open
And in the next step, we will go a bit in depth in different accessibility policies in the EU. So this basically is as a kind of introduction to what are the different regulations, etc., and directives, policies that apply at the EU level, but also to the different member countries of the EU. I've also noticed that there are a few non-EU member countries, at least the ones who are non-EU from Europe are mostly likely aspiring towards the EU. So for them, it's quite relevant because it's also a good way to kind of promote this type of policies as well at the national level. For the others that are coming maybe from other continents on the US, it can be also a good way to learn for some practices in terms of how legislation is done around EU. So we can go on the next slide, and I start with something that is called why discussing legislation. And I mean, there are two points that are like, one, implementation of EU policies on accessibility is present in general many challenges, but this is when it comes to majority of EU regulation. Because as part of the EU, countries need to do some sort of harmonization. Finally, with something that is called Accessibility Act and other directives, they are pushing towards more harmonization when it comes to developing accessibility in many different fields. Also, with the project we just presented, Accessible EU, we are basically supporting all stakeholders included, whether these are public authorities or civil society organizations like we are, to actually assure the effective implementation. And here I put a really strong point on the role of civil society because it's majority presence, I would say, within this conference of civil society actors. If you want to ask your national or EU policymakers to talk to make things more accessible, you need to speak their language. So think about legislation, discussing legislation as learning a new language, and that's learning the language of the policymakers. Because if you want to influence them to make even the minor change, it's important that you know what are the areas and what are the things that they are obliged to do. As sometimes they try to avoid this and not to do it, as we know from different practices, but also sometimes they need the support and the expertise that we all have. So I'll move forward to the main EU legislation on accessibility. Everything that you see everything that you can find on the slide, there are like 5 legislative pieces, which are mainly directives. The fact that these are directives, those are acts, basically when the EU adopts them, it gives obligation to all the member states to develop, to implement them at the national level, or something that we call transposition, meaning that they have to develop laws, policies within their own countries on these acts and basically what these acts present and the standards that these acts basically present. So, for example, when we talk about the European Accessibility Act, if you were at the session yesterday in the afternoon, there was this key person from the Commission, Katarina Knežević, who is basically the director of the social affairs, the body basically that was behind drafting of this key legislation piece. She was talking about it a lot. It's like, this is a key basically document that actually was developed a couple of years ago, 2019, and is now a requirement for most member states to develop different legal frameworks at the national level to accessibility, but also to harmonize between themselves. So meaning that it makes it easier for all citizens to have accessibility across the EU because it's also a free market, it's a free movement area. So what basically this act presents is minimum accessibility standards for a range of products. And here we talk about products, it's from computers to operating system, ATMs, tickets for festivals, check-ins, TVs that you buy, this type of products. Services from phone to banking to e-commerce, for everything that is across the European Union. And by ensuring that the different laws, as I said at the start, will be harmonized so that there will be a smooth operations of the internal market. So it's also about a lot of how trade is done and how companies and different actors will actually act within to make sure that whatever it's done, it's actually whatever is produced or is put out as a service basically will be accessible to everyone. one key piece when it comes to directives, member states are obliged to develop national transpositions and standardizations, but they are also free to devise their own ways of reaching these accessibility standards. However, they are not alone. So this is also something that we will refer later in the presentation. I'm putting most of the attention of the Accessibility Act because this is basically the newest, but also the one that is the most comprehensive directive, and it's really complementing everything that everything else that was done before, which include from the Web Accessibility Directive, which basically sets out harmonized legal framework for online services, like what is how online services needs to be accessible. Public Procurement Directive that basically lay out standards of how different procurement procedures have to be accessible to everyone in all the countries. The European Electronic Communication Code, I think, is by its name, you can see there is a very specific one related to market of telecommunications, but it's also a very important one because it's making sure that information technology and telecommunications are also accessible specifically for people with disabilities, and as well as the Audiovisual Media Service Directive that basically is regulating the content of the TVs and radio and everything else that you see as an audio visual media. So that is very much in short. All of these directives and pieces of legislations actually are very much in line and working to achieve the UN Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities, specifically Article 9 that is related on accessibility. And as I said, two key things maybe to get out from here, because you can find all of this online, you can find the content of it, but maybe the key takeout from this, from talking about this type of legislation is that one, they always have to be transposed into national laws, and secondly, member states have their kind of are free a bit to how to devise their own ways to move forward, and we see how we can help them in that as well.
For me, that's very important because this is the main difference between a regulation and a directive. With the regulation, you need to implement it as it is, and with the directive, you can have some national margin of action.
Yes, and that is indeed, and thank you for sharing that. That is indeed among the key differences and why it is important to know what you can do basically at the national level. If we move to the next slide, very quickly in terms of what are these main objectives, and then we can also go into what are the key stakeholders, so we'll get a bit more in depth who has what roles. So firstly, to ensure that accessibility is a precondition, that basically whenever you develop any service or any product, that it has to basically also be developed on an equal basis for everyone, but also that the services in future actually remove barriers for people with disabilities. Another thing is, this is very much in line with all the directives and regulations within the EU, is to make harmonization of rules, to make basically easier access and movement of goods and people between the countries of the EU or the member states, to drive better innovation, basically to ensure that better products are put on the open market, that customers have access to more quality products, that there is a more inclusive offer for everyone, and to have a positive outcome for all. And I think they're all, I mean, quite self-explained and something that we as within the sector and as a civil society organizations working within the accessibility and disability field are all what we strive for. So I'll move to the next one in terms of who are the key players or stakeholders. So one is the public authorities, and there is a big bunch of both EU but also national authorities. And their role is, especially when we talk about the national one, is to transpose laws and monitor their implementation. So as we mentioned, because it's a directive, the EU basically says to member states, okay, now you need to develop based on the standards that we have adopted within this act. You need to develop laws, policies, different type of standards that will help every actors, especially economic operators, and the states themselves, to become more accessible within their products and services. However, the EU role doesn't end up by developing this directive, and that is another important thing to remember, especially if you're working with national authorities to promote such directives, because the EU, basically the Commission, so the directives are adopted by the Council, where your Prime Minister, if you're a EU member state, or a President sits, but then the Commission says as well, okay, we're going to monitor how you implement this, and then they have as well a working group that is monitoring the implementation, particularly in the Accessibility Act. And secondly, you can send them complaints and say, well, you know, we are still missing standardization or this, or the standardization is on this specific item is not going well, and we need more things to be done at the national level. So this also helps actually the national public authorities to keep them in check to some way. And the Commission is not like, I mean, often we tend to think of this like, okay, this is a big body. You already met the Commission yesterday, which was basically the director in social affairs. So her and her team are basically working on ensuring that this type of monitoring and implementation happens. Economic actors, basically operators, are the ones who modify product services, companies, from internet companies to like transportation companies to everyone else who is on the market. And of course, the civil society organizations, who I would say have a very active role in monitoring specifically and reviewing the transposition and impact of the directives at the national level, and can report back via the different bodies. You also have also the national level, there is different monitoring bodies that are specific agencies that are monitoring the implementation of these directives. And that are where the civil society organizations can also be active and flag things that are not working or that need more depth within this transposition. Then we can move forward and almost closing this piece. What are the key success factors for legislation? There is a lot of things, but maybe among the, I would say among the key ones is, it's a both factor, but it's also a challenge. Finding this balance between the quite ambitious scopes of the requirements. So the requirements that are in directives are to some extent maybe, I mean, are not as ambitious because they are also presented kind of a minimal requirements that the member states have to oblige to in order to become more accessible. Which means that on one hand, if we want to be more ambitious, but have at the same time harmonization of rules that is within the EU, that can also create challenge in itself, mainly because but we need to ensure that all the policies can be implemented across the member states. And many stakeholders basically want to advocate for a greater scope or stricter minimum requirements, which will basically in theory result with a higher degree of accessibility. And this is what I would say is a lot of the role on organizations who are advocating for more accessibility or are working with disabilities or are representing people with disabilities. They're the ones who can really strive for this a lot. Another key factor is making sure that we have everyone on board, particular involvement of organizations who are DPOs or disability persons organizations, including whether they do advocacy, whether they do periodic reviews, whether they help the practical by giving practical information to their national legislators. There is a lot that basically we as people here in this room can do, and I think is one of my key highlights on this as a key success factors. Then having a clear interpretation leading to effective monitoring. This is simple, but our experience in the past says that laws can be very vague even when they're adopted at the national level. So it's important that we can help national legislators to do proper interpretation, or we can ask from the Commission to do the interpretation because it's their role within the implementation of such directives. Then kind of setting up a robust standardization process. Fernando will speak about it, so I'll skip this for going more in depth. Networking and the peer learning, I think it says by itself. We really need to ensure, if we want to promote accessibility and ensure accessibility of products, that we also have to offer training opportunities and upskill workers within those companies to understand what accessibility is in order to be able to develop products, and to network also with organizations who represent people with disability to understand the needs that are existing, and also to mainstream accessibility. It's not about developing services for a particular group, it's to ensure that everything that we do as a service and a product is accessible to everyone without any excuses. And using moments like this, of course, to raise your awareness that you can go back to your legislators and ask for more when it comes to accessibility. And with this slide, basically, we will close. In terms of the transposition of the Accessibility Act, as you might recall yesterday, among the key aspects of the presentation was, okay, when the directive is adopted at the EU level, the member states also have a specific deadline in which they need to develop this transposition and the national law, the standardizations. So this deadline has been closed last year. And only 5 countries have transposed the EEA into a national law. And most of them are doing different measures. So only 5 managed within the deadline. Others managed to do it in the time past the deadline. But we are still waiting for 4 countries to do more, which is Bulgaria, Cyprus, Netherlands, and Poland. They haven't done any measure related to the EEA, which also, if you're coming or you're working within those countries, is a good sign that maybe there is something that, as a civil society representative or somebody who is working with national legislator, can do to foster this. Then the European Commission, we said, is the driver, and they can really help in this by there is also a strategy for persons for the rights of persons with disabilities, which is a key policy framework for the improvement of accessibility. And here we talk about, like, you can use this to even launch a project at the very national level. The strategy in itself gives you even more tools and directions where you can do the improvements. Most of the projects and activities that are happening at the EU level are also driven by this type of framework, so it's very good to use them. And everything that we just presented, you can also find in a report that we have produced with the Accessible EU project. It's very much more in-depth presentation. This was a very quick tryout for me to give you the glimpse out of it, but it basically gives you a very good overview of all the EU legislation on accessibility and also how it is transpositioned within the different EU countries. So it can be a very good resource. We'll share this after the session, so you will be able directly to access on the link. Also, if you are working and you're an organization that works with that wants to get engaged more with the Accessibility Act, there is, and I mean, that's a document that is quite long, so it's not the most user-friendly thing, but there is also an easy-to-read version that has been produced by our friends in Inclusion Europe, and you can find them in their website. And it's a very easy and friendly tool, actually, to present and to familiarize everyone with this directive. And I'll stop here because this has been a lot of input. And now I want to open the floor for some discussion via, again, believe it or not, the Mentimeter. So we already use the menti.com. I'll ask you to go back to menti.com, but use a different sign. If you are joining us first time, so.
And let's check if it's the same one, because it's changed. So
yes, so we need to use a different code because yes, the code changes sometimes.
I don't know what happened. For example, in mine, I told them to use them for 7 days, so it had worked, but it didn't. So let's see.
But what is a workshop without technical issues?
Yes.
So you can all go to menti.com. Use the QR code that will be shared in a second on the screen, or just go directly on menti.com and use the following code: 35237963. So 35237963, and we'll have some questions for you. So we have divided this Menti in a couple of sections. One is, we can go right immediately. One is discussion on the kind of knowledge of the legislation, which can just refer to just general knowledge of legislations within this room. And we can go immediately with the first question. I invite you to interact, at least for the ones who are here in the room. Did you all manage to connect before we proceed? Okay, I see people are nodding. It seems that it's fine. If you're online, please as well let us know if you have any difficulties.
The code is 35.
The code is 35237963. Works?
Imenti.com.
Yes. Great. All right. So these are very easy questions. What I'm asking you now is like, how well do you know the content of the EU legislation on accessibility? So you have not at all, a little, or a lot. There are three responses. So how well do you know the content of your legislation on accessibility? Not at all, a little, or a lot. So far we have 10 that know a little, 2 that have a lot. That's very well. All right, so we get more answers in between. Can I maybe just have some way to interact with the ones who said that they have a lot? We have 3 people who have a lot of knowledge, which I think it's also good to use this as a space for sharing expertise. Yes, please go.
Hi, I'm Bianca Prince. I'm Global Head of Accessibility at ING Bank. And I've been studying the European Accessibility Act for a while now, also in combination with other legislation and how to apply. And also, and that's maybe even more interesting, also how we can combine the EAA with, for example, banking regulations from the ECB. So one of the key things which we have worked on is actually embedding the obligation to inform customers very well. To combine that with EAA. So that also brings options that in countries with less interpretation of the EAA, that you can also introduce options like, okay, there's now clear definition that you have to include Braille in paper version, for example. But by the information obligation from the ECB, you can say, okay, we do have to do this, because if a person is depending on Braille, you cannot inform the person completely. So it's not just about EAA, but it's also about combining it with existing legislation, which sometimes even weighs heavier, because for banks, ECB regulation weighs often heavier than the EAA would. So.
Great, thank you very much. This is actually quite an interesting resource to share, and I think it's exactly what we talk about. The harmonization is obviously not only about the member states, but it's also the harmonization with other existing rules that organizations are obliged to respect.
Yeah, and also if you do that, it makes it easier, because we work in 10 European countries. There are 10 different European interpretations. I'm officially resided in the Netherlands. I did see the Dutch regulations, and to be honest, I'm not really proud of that version compared to other countries, because they leave a lot of opportunities, for example, for the economic burden being too high. And in my perception, it's less on the importance. They use the risks the wrong way around. So the burden on the company, but they don't look at the impact on the customer itself. So if you turn that around, the risk is changing a lot. And that's, if you, from that perspective, the burden becomes less, because the person in question can be at higher risk of fraud, being victim of fraud, for example. So that's the combination, but it's the combination of legislation, but it's also the combination of different countries and how they regulate. And that's, I think, the hardest part of it. And my advice would be, from business perspective, to take the strongest regulation and make that your bottom line. Because otherwise you always have to have additional addendums. And if you share, for example, components on digital or share components physically among countries, you always have to do a second risk assessment in the country itself. And you don't want to do that. So in prevention of that and in prevention of overwork, which is money, that's where you say, okay, we put a higher standard in. And that would be my strong recommendation. And that's also the recommendations I gave to ING.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much for sharing this actually very, very useful input, not only for, for everyone in the room, but I think maybe if I can take one thing, even though this is your example specifically related to banking services, I think it's important for all the aspects of products and services to try to take the higher standards and higher requirements when it comes to accessibility, also to ensure not only the accessibility itself, but also more safety for all customers. And yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. I suggest we move for the next question. How well do you know the content of your country's legislation on accessibility? Again, the same three responses: not at all, a little, and a lot. So if you are aware of what are the country's legislation on accessibility, so again, we have majority at a little. It's very good that we don't have not at all. So that means that there is already some level of information, and hopefully via this workshop and the resources that we are presenting, this can be strengthened. I'll move immediately then to the next question, as we have few other questions that are related to discussions and gathering a bit more in depth of your practices. So let's see a bit into engaging with stakeholders and what is the group's experience here in engaging with stakeholders. So the one question is, who are or should be your main national partners when it comes to accessibility? This is an open question on which you can write responses. So who are or should be your main national partners when it comes to accessibility? Let's see what are your ideas around that. All right, so we're already having some answers. Interest group, authoring authority, DPOs, local authorities, government, professional associations, interest groups. We have again economical partners. Is there anyone coming here from a DPO in this room? From a disability person or organization representing people with disabilities? Okay, anyone coming from any of the other partners that were already mentioned here? We heard of one economic and banking society.
And we have some from public authorities also.
We have from public authorities. Okay, that will be also good to hear in terms of where do you see, in terms of how would you like to maybe cooperate with other partners that are mentioned here, and if there has been anything that maybe you have done so far related to accessibility with other partners or as a public authority, if somebody would like to share as well. Yes, please go ahead. You can also share who you are.
I work in a public authority in a ministry in Lithuania, and I'm mostly working with European Accessibility Act and its implementation. I'm coordinating its implementation in my country, and of course I need to coordinate all the process. So it's between market surveillance authorities who are doing a very important job. I mean, they will be doing once European Accessibility Act is coming into force. Definitely other specialized public authorities who are specialized on the rights of people with disability coming into all this action. And as well, definitely NGOs. Some are doing some consulting work for implementation of European Accessibility Act, and yeah, basically we are doing consultation and some. Yeah, I guess I mentioned. So there are a few actors who are working towards the implementation.
And can you maybe turn off your mic as well? And that we will, for interpretation purposes, we can only have one mic at a time. So after you're speaking, just make sure you turn off the microphone. Thank you very much for sharing. I think this is not only giving us what you do as well, but it's quite a good and interesting positive practice, because it really showcases something that we were talking about this like different and multi-stakeholder approach, especially when it comes to the national and the local transposition of the act. And I think it's also very good to hear that there is a work being done, and that there is even a person working on the Accessibility Act, even at the not only the national but also at the local level. And it's a very positive and a good example to hear about. So thank you very much for sharing. We can move to the next slide. One is, have you engaged with DPOs or disability persons organizations or organizations representing people with disability to analyze national legislation and policies on accessibility? And the responses are between never, sometimes, and often. So we already have 3 answers. So if you have engaged with disability organizations to analyze national legislation and policies on accessibility, it doesn't have to be this act, it can be any policies related to the national level. It's never, sometimes, or often. And from the responses coming in, we find that majority has done it sometimes. We have only 1 response, never. But I think what is also very encouraging is to see that there are quite some responses of often. And that's a very interesting thing to learn about. Would anybody like to share, especially from the ones that have been cooperating often with disability organizations to analyze these national legislations? Anyone would like to share a story or an example? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sorry, me again. What we've been doing, I've been involved in, next to my work at ING, I also do research. And based on that, I have been working with Iedereen from the Netherlands, which is the overarching disability organization. And what we had done is actually that Iedereen reached out to me and a few other people in business to see how they could work on the reply, to the first draft of the Accessibility Act in the Netherlands. The interesting part for me was that from their perspective, they were quite careful. I noticed that a few of the businesses would have been more straight out on how to approach, because in the Netherlands, they implemented the European Accessibility Act and divided it over 5 departments, which is very scary because the departments do not work together and will be hard to enforce. And my personal recommendation was to have 1 act and not divide it over departments. And I noticed that in that discussion that the Iedereen, as a disability representative organization, was over careful from my perspective. And I'm quite curious how that works in other countries, because we do see that the organizations are subsidized by governments and often find it hard to be direct if they don't agree. And I'm curious how that impacted other countries.
Thank you very much. Yeah, again, I think it's thank you for sharing this example. It's a quite interesting practice. Do we have any other example from another country related to involving DPOs in the analyzing national legislation? Maybe from some of the participants online? Okay, we have someone else here in the room. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Luxembourg, from the Ministry of Family. And for us, it's usually we in our ministry are the national coordinator of the implementation of the CRPD. So for us, it's mandatory to send every kind of draft law from any ministry on any kind of subject to our National Council of People with Disabilities. And on any subject, we usually are very strongly in touch with them, and also from all their federations with all the main countries' organizations in it, to receive any kind of feedback from the terrain on what needs to be changed and needs changes in legislation. So it's working quite well. Yeah, that's what I can say for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. I think it's another interesting example. It's good to know that there is already a requirement existing for the consultation with disability organizations, which I think it's a quite interesting practice that can be applied on a different level, whether this is local or other countries. And with that, I would say we close for this part, because we also need to cover the standardization. Thank you very much for engaging in this discussion via Menti. There are a few other questions that were left, but if we have the time at the end, we can go back to them. In the meantime, I'll pass the floor to Fernando for the standardization aspects on what we can learn on transpositioning at national level.
Okay, so thanks a lot. First of all, as I want to recap on something that was said yesterday. I think that the example that the person from the US Access Board, sorry, because it's a complicated name. So he's playing yesterday what they did in the US years ago. And they are an example for all of us, because they have a great surveillance system. They have a lot of experiences of people demanding and forcing for the implementation of accessibility. And he's saying that they created the legislation for the accessibility of the federal buildings, and then they developed the standards specifying the requirements within the US Access Board. So, and this is more or less the idea for this session. That's what we are currently doing on. Something have already been done. Some key things have already been done, and let's check it. First of all, why are we accessible? When I say we, I say here with the hat of Accessible EU, talking about standards. What are we trying to do? So we are convinced that European standards and European standardization works supporting the European Accessibility Act are a key goal for us, and are a key goal for the real implementation of the European Accessibility Act in the European Union. So that's why we are there. First of all, what's a standard? Standard, because here the differences with the with the US start. A standard is a voluntary document. That voluntary document is drafted within the consensus of all the relevant stakeholders, or at least that's our main goal, to have all the relevant stakeholders at the table, with very clear and very transparent processes and rules. And for example, you will see later the main European stakeholders at the standardization level. The rules are public. You can access them online, all the different procedures, the approval procedures, the consensus procedures, how you had to manage a meeting, with how much anticipation you need to distribute the documents, and so on, and so on, and so on. Which is publicly available, which doesn't mean that it's for free. It means that you can buy it. Some European standards organizations, for example, ETSI, has the documents for free in their platform, but the default situation is that you need to buy the standards, or, for example, if you are an association of persons with disabilities, in Accessible EU, Fundación 11, I think that they still haven't done it, but they are about to do it. Maybe they have already done it. They have signed an agreement with the distributor of the Spanish standards, and they have put in their platform accessibilities the three main accessibility European standards for free in their platform. If you are an organization of persons with disabilities or a researcher, you can register at that platform, and I think that you will, because I think the documents still are not there, but they will be there in an accessible format, be able to access the documents. But the main thing is that they are not secret documents. You can access them, you can buy them, you can get them wherever you want, and very important, they are approved by a standardization body. So that's a standard. So the main question here will be, and how can standards make a difference if they are voluntary? This is something that, at least at national level, some people tell us, well, if they are voluntary, what's in it for me? Why do I need to worry about them? Why do I need to cooperate? Why do I need to know them? Well, because first of all, I will try to give you 3 reasons today. The main one is, for me, that they represent the state of the art. I mean, they provide a common language to evaluate performance. They make interoperability of component services possible. And a great example are things like, for example, the USB, or for example, the power sockets. If we didn't have standards, we wouldn't be, and with power sockets, it's a bit crazy. But the thing is that one of our main goals is having common rules, voluntary rules, but common rules that everybody could use. And if you want to cooperate with others, either cooperating, either selling, either buying, or whatever, it's better to use those documents that were drafted by the main stakeholders with a consensus. So that's what everybody at the table found acceptable, and that could do to provide a service, to provide a product, or whatever. And they protect consumers because they ensure safety, durability, and market equity. So I think that the main driver is that great professionals, leading businesses, public authorities, if they want to buy or if they want to know what do the stakeholders find as acceptable, they will need to know at least the state of the art and do something about that. For me, that will be the main goal, or the main. But it still can be a bit aspirational. Another important thing is that the agreements between parties can make standards mandatory. So whenever you have a contract, you can insert in your contract a reference to an obligation in that contract to fulfill a standard. When we're talking about accessibility, maybe you are interested in buying or in providing a service fulfilling with those the key accessibility standards. And that way, it's not in legislation, it's in a contract, so it's obliging both parties to work under that umbrella of those accessibility standards. That's a very important thing, especially when we go to private contracts. And since 2014, we have the Public Procurement Directive, and that Public Procurement Directive really made a difference, or should have done a difference, because it says in an article, in the article on award criteria, it says, for all procurement which is intended for use by natural persons, The technical specifications should take into account the accessibility criteria for persons with disabilities or designed for all users. This is not between commas because I simplified it a bit, but what does it say? It said that if your product, if your service is going to be used by persons, then it should be accessible. You need to take into account accessibility. So whenever the public administration is buying a product or a service, it should be accessible. And accessibility should be an award criteria. And if you don't have that accessibility, you will need to justify why it isn't accessible. Because if not, you're buying inequity and you are increasing the discrimination. Another important point is that that same directive says that you can define the requirements either as functional specifications or as technical specification or as a mixture of both of them. But the important thing is that sorry, is it here? Yes. So either as functional requirements or as technical specification or as a mixture between all of them. What has happened here? You cannot see my screen? Well, whatever. So again, but the first preference when it talks about referring to technical specifications is to make reference to European standards. The European standards adopted by your national standards body, but which means the European standards. So if you are a public administration, you have a great tool because if you have European standards on accessibility, you can reference to it in your private procurement specifications, and you're on the safe side because you know that the requirements are going to be appropriate, and you know that you're not going to be sweetened because you are asking for things that cannot be fulfilled. Okay, and then you have international standards, national standards, many other things, but European standards are the key goal. So I think that's a very important thing. Which are the directives that are requiring accessibility? 1 second. Yes. The Web Accessibility Directive, for example, it's for public websites and public mobile applications. So the Public Procurement Directive is really important for that directive because it's about buying ICT products and services, mobile public websites and mobile applications. And we have already in place, but it will be compulsory a bit later, 2025, the European Accessibility Act, and it applies to some products, but they're important products. The consumer, let's not enter into that because that's public information. And let's go to the third point. My third reason for why standards are important for you, even if they're voluntary. Because some standards become harmonized standards. What that harmonized standard means? It means that whenever there is a European standard, most of them are done because, I think that all of them are done with following this process. The European Commission says, well, we have a directive, we have a regulation, but it has the main guidelines, the main requirements. For example, websites should be accessible. And you can say, well, and how can I prove that this website is accessible? So the European Commission told the European standards organizations, please develop a document that we can use, that people could use to provide presumption of conformity with the essential requirements of the directive. So what happened? We had 301549, which is the European standard for the accessibility of ICT products and services, and Susanna, who is the chair of that technical committee, is here. Sadly, you're hidden after Susanna, but I know that you're here. So there are two key experts in that field and in that technical committee where that document is produced. And we had that standard is mainly based on the documents from W3C on WCAG, and the first document was developed in 2014. That document evolved, and the previous the current edition of the EN is referenced in the European Journal of the European Commission, and that means that if you fulfill with the technical requirements given in that EN, you are on the safe side, you can say that that ICT product and service is accessible, which is great for you when you're providing a product or service, or for you where you are buying that, or for you when you are asking your government or your organization or your company to get something accessible, so an ICT product or service accessible. So that's a great tool. And it's not harmonized until the European Commission referenced the document in the official journal of the European Union. And that those standards have a specific annex. It's usually Annex ZA, where it relates the essential requirements of the directive with the clauses given in the EN that you need to fulfill. Okay. Next point, which are the what has the European Commission done with the European Accessibility Act? Because we already have the EN 301549 for the Web Accessibility Directive. And once they launched the new European Directive, the European Accessibility Act, they say, well, we have these great guidances, but we need to specify this further. So they launched a standardization request to the 3 European standards organizations, Standardisation and ETSI, and they say, can you draft standards helping people to provide presumption of conformity with the essential requirements that we have in the directive? And they have a specific program. It had already been negotiated, but the specific program was, let's draft 3 brand new harmonized standards. These 3 brand new standards will be a standard on the accessibility of non-ICT information related to products. That's going to be developed in the SEN and SELECT Joint Technical Committee 12 on Design for All. Another harmonized standard on the accessibility of support services related to products and services. It affects to help desk, call centers, technical support, relay services, training services, not only online services, also for the presential support services. It's also going to be developed by SAN-SELECT JTC 12, Design for All. I'm saying it's going to be because they still haven't started that work due to several reasons, but they're doing their best. And there's also a brand new standard on the accessibility of emergency communications and for the answering of emergency communications by the PSAPs, the PSAPs. And that level, the ETSI Technical Committee ENTEL on emergency telecommunications has already quite advanced work. They are developing first, I don't know if it's a technical specification or a technical report, and once there is consensus on that document, they will scale that up as a standard, and it will be a harmonized standard. There's a lot already done by this technical committee on that point. Okay, so these are the 3 brand new standards. And then we have 3 standards that were already there, but need to be reviewed to be harmonized to the directive. The first one is the one that I have already explained, which is 301549, accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. This is going to be harmonized according to the Web Accessibility Directive, as before, but also according to the European Accessibility Act. The umbrella technical committee is the SAN, SELECT, and ETSI. So it's a joint technical body of the 3 European standards organizations, which is called e-accessibility, not a very original name, but very easy to remember. And the practical work, the day-to-day work, the drafting work is being performed by the ETSI Technical Committee Human Factors, okay, as before and as in the previous editions. There's also a very complex standard, in my opinion, which is the 17161, Design for All, accessibility following a Design for All approach in products, goods, and services, and extending the range of users. This document was developed and is being developed by SAN-SELECT JTC 12, Design for All, and they have a very hard work to do because they have to reshape the document, which is a very good document, but somehow a bit ethereal or a bit theoretical. They have to shape it up because it will be a tool to to show conformance with the directive. So they have a very hard work to do, and they're starting that. They have already started that. And we have, last of all, the 172110, sorry, accessibility and usability of the built environment, requirements and recommendations, which is being developed by the Sensen Lake Joint Technical Committee 11, accessibility of the built environment. I'm the secretary of the first two ones, of the Sensen Lake and ETSI Joint Technical Committee on accessibility, and the one on accessibility of the built environment. For example, in accessibility, in the one on ICT products and services, Susana, who is here, is the chair. On the one of accessibility of the built environment, Jesus Hernández Galán for Fundación 11, and you were able to hear him yesterday, is the chair. And why in this directive, which is mainly about products and services, why there's a point on accessibility of the built environment? Because the directive, and this is an example of the flexibility of the European directives, has a specific article, Article 4.4, where it says that if the national authority decides that to oblige to fulfill accessibility of the built environment, whenever a service or product covered by the European Accessibility Act for the environment where a product or service covered by the directive is provided, they can oblige. So some countries, for example, my country, Spain, has included that point on the transposition. For example, Spain and Sweden, we have said that we already have legislation that can support the fulfillment of those requirements on the accessibility of the built environment. And others have said, yes, we're going to approve it. So for having clear requirements on that, we had a standard on technical functional requirements. So we had absolutely no dimension, no slope for ramps, no whatever, because it was only on the functional level. It was a quite flexible document because people could use national level, national values from the legislation. Now we are obliged to include when the functional requirements are not objectively verifiable, which is the important point, because that requirements need to be objectively verifiable. You need to say, I fulfill this or I don't fulfill this. So in some cases, we are going to be forced to include for some values. So this is a exciting story. So would you like to be a part of this? So here we're going to focus on practical things on how can you join the standards, these standards works. So how can you join the standardization community? And what could that give you? If you join the standardization community, you're going to have early knowledge of the consensus requirements. So you are going to know what's going on, what's going to be compulsory, what's not going to be compulsory from the early drafts. Because if not, you're going to know that whenever there's a vote, a national vote, a public vote, or when the documents are published, which it may fit you, it may be okay, it may be sufficient. But if you want to influence and to have early knowledge, you should join the standardization community. A very important point, the standardization works at least on select level is done at national level. So we have national delegations where the national stakeholders gather and meet. For us, it's a good way because we can speak the same our national language, and then we prepare the comments in English and we send the documents. But the debate at national level is done in our language, which is an important point. At least in Spain, not all the stakeholders are fluent in English. And we have this debate, these discussions, we clarify the national position, and then we send the national comments, or we send a national delegates to the technical committee to explain their position and to defend the national position. So that's the default way. And some persons who are nominated by their countries, they participate as delegates or as experts, and they participate in the meetings, they draft, they comment, they dedicate a lot of time to that. So those persons are the ones helping to shape out the documents, and that will in the end have a impact in our daily life. And I want to say some difference with the US Access Board. The US Access Board told us that they have 20 persons in their staff. In European standardization, we have lots of experts because we have the national experts, we have the national delegates, the national experts to the technical committees and to the working groups. So the network of experts and the diversity of the stakeholders is much broader. It has some cons, which means that sometimes we have to need consensus between stakeholders that have very different interests. And it has another con is that it usually takes us more time to us to get agreements because of this diversity. But I have a thing that I'm convinced that in the long term, it's a great advantage for us. Also, people always say that we are very slow. So these are the key stakeholders. At international level, ISO and IEC. You also have ITU for telecommunications, but that's a UN Nations agency. So it's mostly for member states and also for some companies who are members of ITU. So, and at the European level, CEN/SELEC and ETSI. So if you want to participate at national level, that's the best way, the default way for ISO, IEC, CEN, and SELEC. In ETSI is direct participation of the organization. So you have whether you are a private organization or a public organization, you can become an ETSI member and you participate directly. Not they don't have national delegations. Okay, so that's how it works. And what are we doing in Accessible EU on this? Well, we are first of all, we are present, well, apart from dissemination, we are present in the key European technical bodies. Many of us, for example, as I said, I'm the secretary of some of them. I'm the part of the national delegation in some of the others. So some of us are have an indirect participation of Accessible EU. I mean, when I work as a secretary, I need to be neutral, and I'm representing. I'm the secretary, so I cannot take part for any parties. But I'm an Accessible EU expert, and some of the chairs are Accessible EU experts. Some of the experts, for example, the chair of the Joint Technical Committee on Design for All is one of the French national experts of Accessible EU. So we have this indirect participation, but we are just about to start because it's already been signed, but we need to receive the paper email. So that's already been signed. We are going to have a direct participation. So we are going to have three Accessible EU experts who will talk in the name of Accessible EU in ICT accessibility, in design for all, and in accessibility of the built environment. And they will raise the voice of our national experts to help us to contribute to improve those documents. And we also promote in the workshop, as this one, the knowledge and how to participate. We also have, as Ivana has said regarding public policies, we also have a guidance document in the website of Accessible EU that you can access. It's a very practical document helping you to know who is your national standards body and which are the conditions to participate there. And if you have any difficulty or whatever, you can contact us and we can serve as focal contact points to try to ease your participation there. Now, I'm not going to do a lot of to this code because we are going to have a Menti, but as this has changed, let me use my one. Where is this? Here. So that's a new Menti. In this case, why cannot I see it? Sorry. Come back. Present. Okay. I know sharing it. Okay, great, Fernando. Sorry for this. Share my screen. No, this other one. I can use it. Great. So if you enter in Menti in 1922-3985, I will repeat it again. Menti.com 1922-3985. Okay. And here we will have 3 blocks. So we are not going to have any debate, the debate after every slide. We will have debate after every row of slides, okay? Every block. This first block is on the knowledge of the standardization system. I am sure that you will have been able to join it. So for the first question is, are you familiar with any of these standards bodies? The first option is SEN, which is the one on non-electric standardization at European level, SENELEC, which is on electrical standardization at European level, ETSI on telecommunications standardization at European level, ISO on non-electric at European level, IEC on electric at international level, sorry, and ITU on telecommunications and at international level. So most of you are familiar with ISO. I assume that the 9000 series of quality has a big role on this, because most of us in organizations fulfill with 9001 and all those quality standards. And so most of you are familiar with ISO, but I see that there's less knowledge on SENELEC and ETSI. Okay, that's great feedback. Then second question, have you ever used an accessibility standard? Have you ever read one? Have you ever, the options are never, occasionally, or frequently. Is your everyday job. You, for example, you are a consultant and you are always working with accessibility standards, okay? So have you ever used in THEO 1549, have you ever used 17161 on design follow? Have you ever used 17210? Have you ever used ISO 21542 on accessibility of the built environment, or any of those other documents? So most persons occasionally, which is great news. It's great news that in this workshop we've never received the never or the none feedback. Thanks a lot. And 11% frequently. Okay. And this, the third one here is, are you aware if standards are referenced either legislation in legislation either at European level or at national level in the following fields? This is in this case you have to choose a percentage. If you strongly disagree or if you strongly agree. Okay, you have to choose. The first field will be ICT accessibility. The second field will be accessibility of the built environment. And the third point will be accessibility of services. So do you agree or do you not agree that in any of these fields, standards are referenced in the legislation? Okay, so we have quite a strong agreement that in ICT accessibility and in accessibility of the built environment, there's standards are referenced, and also on services.
But it's though quite less.
Quite less, and that's understandable, because I think that until we got the European Accessibility Act, we didn't have a lot of reference to accessibility of services. Okay, great. So I wanted to ask you in this first part, which is the knowledge of the accessibility system. For those of you, let me recap. I see a lot of knowledge of ISO level. What are your reasons for having this knowledge of ISO documents are much less of the European level documents, which is, for me, it's important because it's curious, because from the European perspective, we tend to think that ISO standards are not so much useful for us because they're For example, for all CEN and CELAC members, we are obliged to adopt all European standards and to withdraw any conflicting standards. So that means in 34 countries of Europe, in a broad sense, for example, Turkey is part of CEN and CELAC. So for 34 countries, whenever there's a new European standard, we need to check if we have any conflicting standard, withdraw it, and publish and adopt that European standard as a national standard. But with ISO, it's not compulsory. We can adopt them or not. So for me, it's curious to know that you are much more familiar with ISO than with CEN and CELAC. What happens? Why is this? What's the motive for this knowledge of ISO standards? In your situation, for you personally. Okay, maybe we can discuss that later. And I see that there's an occasional level of knowledge of the European or the CSS standards, and in this, well, I think that it self-explains. So if you don't want to comment anything on the first question, let's move to the next row of block of questions. The second one is on the engagement with the relevant stakeholders. Okay, so the first question on Menti, we have different options. I'm going to read you them because they are the letter is very small, the font, so the font size. Sorry for this. So the question is, in which stakeholder category would you classify yourself or the organization you represent? You can select different several options, okay? Because maybe you have different hats. The first option is persons with disabilities and older persons. The second option is public administration. The third one is industry and commerce. The fourth one is academy and research. The fifth one is standards application. What does this mean? It means conformity assessment organization, laboratories, accreditations, sometimes consultancy. So that's a standards application. Liberal profession, I'm thinking about architects, engineers, designers, person who are providing ICT products and services, but not in big companies, but as liberal professions, and other, which is the it fits everybody. So I see that we have quite a good representation of representative of persons with disabilities. That's great to know, and a quite balanced representation of other groups. Okay, that's great. The second one, which be a different, it's more or less the same question, but in a different sense. The first one was, who do you represent? And this one is, which stakeholder category will be more critical for the development of accessibility standards? So person with disabilities and other persons, public administration, industry and commerce, academy and research, standards application, liberal professions. This is very important because, well, I won't tell you my point of view. Okay. But it's great that I think it seems that all of us agree that one of the key stakeholders, I think that the key one is person with disabilities. But yeah, I'm glad to see that academy, but also industry, because if the industry is not involved and if the industry is not happy with the standards, it's difficult to involve them and to make them fulfill it, because we need to put things that are doable, of course, without withdrawing the main goals and the main goal, which is that things need to be accessible. So standards application is industry and commerce, great. So that I'm really happy to see this outcome, because and this one is a true or lie. So you have to say this. You think that this is true or this is a lie. There's no in between. Okay, it's yes or no. I am aware of which is the national standards body of my country relevant to my activity. So, for example, if you are based in Spain, you know that UNE is the national standards body where you have to go if you want to participate in standardization. So we come from different countries. Are you aware of which is your national standards body? And if you want to participate in standardization, do you know which door do you need to knock to say, hello, I want to participate in standards, and what do I have to do? Another thing is that if the conditions are favorable or not, but if you know that where to go. Oh, happy because more than 3/3 know where to go. That's great. And I again make reference to the Accessible EU guidance document on standardization, where we say who is the different, and whenever the contact person was public, we have the contact name and email of that person, if it was public, of course, for you to be able to contact. And another important one, have you ever participated, or are you participating right now in a standardization technical body? In a technical committee, in a subcommittee, in a working group, in another group, in this kind of I see that most of you haven't, but some at national level, some at European level, some international level. You can select multiple options, because for some people might have worked at national, international, European level. So great, but most of you haven't. So most of you are currently users or possible future experts in standardization. Great. So for me, the big question will be in this: why, if you can share with us, why haven't you participated in standardization? Because you were not aware, because the conditions are not the best ones, because your company doesn't allow you to spend time working on standards, which is a usual situation. What's the reason behind that most of you haven't ever participated in a standardization technical body? If you can share it with us. You're very shy.
Anyone to share their experience in taking part in standardization technical body? Because at least for the ones who haven't, and its majority, can give also a bit of a glimpse of, like, how these meetings look like. So there are 3 people who said yes. Did you really participate?
We have translated. We've only translated one international, originally in English standard into Czech language. So that was our involvement.
So that's a first step. That's a first step and it helps a lot it's an important point at national level. Some countries translate all the documents, some countries don't translate any of them, and they transpose it in the official languages, which are at central level, English, French, and German. Okay, there are 3 in ISO. They are English, French, and Russian. I think so. So. But some countries decide to adopt the documents directly in English. No problem with that. But sometimes, if we adopt them, it makes the national stakeholder easier to use them. So I see you a bit shy. Let's move to the next one. The next point is taking action. So this is why I chose a picture of some women rowing in a rowing team, because that's. If we all row in the same direction, we can get a goal. But if we don't row in the same direction, it's a bit crazy. So the first question is, are you interested in participating in the development of any of the following accessibility standards? I mean, after what you've heard this morning, would you like to participate or not? And in these following fields, the first field will be non-digital information of products and services, accessibility of the built environment, support services, emergency communications, design for all, and ICT accessibility. I mean, the 6 standards that will be, if we do things properly, harmonized according to the European Accessibility Act in the following years. This is important because it gives you an opportunity of being part of that consensus. So when the final documents are produced, if you weren't part of that, you cannot complain a lot because you were given the opportunity of being there, and it's important. Okay, so I see a lot of interest in support services, in design for all, in ICT, in built environment, a bit less on non-digital information, and a bit less on emergency communications. I understand because emergency communications for me is, I think it's very, very, very technical. So I think it's, well, what it is. The second question will be, which elements will be critical for your participation in these standardization projects? Information on how to participate, the language, English, because sometimes it's a barrier, engagement with national stakeholders, being able to engage with them, participation fees, sometimes we have participation fees to join technical committees, travel cost, although nowadays most of the meetings are virtual, sometimes they are physical, face-to-face meetings or hybrid meetings, so sometimes it can be a barrier. The accessibility of the documents themselves. I have to tell you that we have some issues with the copyrights. To protect copyright, most of us do horrible PDFs with a lot of safety measures that decrease or withdraw the accessibility of the documents. So, but in the day-to-day, we work with Word files, with these kind of things. So we try to do them accessible, not always, they are not. And the accessibility of the meetings, sometimes I would like to know if that will be critical for you, because that's also can be sometimes a barrier. I mean, sometimes, for example, here in all Accessible EU meetings, we have captions, and we also have sign language, but we don't have budget and standardization to have them in all our meetings. For example, I'm going to start. We are doing we're going to start receiving some funding from the European Commission. So in my case, I will be able to, for example, to have accessibility measures in 3 meetings, but only in 3 meetings. So in the other ones, some users might not have this, will not be able to participate on the safe food. Susanna.
So thank you, and excuse me for interfering in your presentation, but Shadi and I just discussed the problems, and this is no criticism of you or the Mentimeter thing, but it's just very difficult when you see statistic like this. If you take this out of the context, it could be interpreted as accessibility of meetings are not as important as other things. And we are at a conference with, because very few people voted on that, so to speak. So I think this is why we have had a problem previously in Standardisation, and this is not the only reason, but I mean, it makes the whole perception of what is important for people with disabilities completely biased, because just because not for everyone the accessibility of the meeting is not important, then it will always be ranked as a low priority, if you see what I mean. And this is why in standards we are still doing very, very, very bad things. And then we have a problem that we have a lack of representation with people with disabilities. And that is when I took over as the chair of the Joint Technical Body, this is one of the first things that we really tried to do. It's like changing or trying to change the course of a supertanker, because the standardization bodies are old and conservative and so on, and also all the IT systems are also old and difficult to change. But I think we need to be very, very careful when we look at statistics or data like this, so that we don't think that this actually means that the accessibility of the meeting is not important. It's one of the most important things for some people, and just because they are not in a majority, we cannot say that it's not the most important thing. So we had another discussion. It's just this comes, it repeats itself all the time, and it's very easy to become biased or to make wrong conclusions of this kind of data, so to speak. So
in extension to your comments, Susanna, this is Bianca, maybe, and that's something, if we talk about, and from business what we learned, is that what we are discussing actually internally is if you discuss or if you review any policies, that the document must be accessible for all. And I think maybe if to elevate this discussion, it is something to bring in on Parliament, EU parliamental level, to say, okay, if you have standards to review, accessibility must be a minimum criteria for any document to be sent out. I think unless you reach that point, that is something, even with an inaccessible ICT system, if you send out a documentation and the documentation is accessible, then at least people can give feedback, even if it's around the system. But this must be something you regulate on a higher level. If it's business or politics, it doesn't matter. But you really have to regulate it in a certain level. Otherwise, you're always going to have groups falling out. And I totally agree, because it is something which often comes last. But I can also personally say how annoying it is to receive a report on accessibility from one of your countries and you cannot read it yourself. So that sucks.
On the accessibility, I fully agree with you, Susanna. I take for granted that the built environment of the national standards body is accessible. I take that for granted. but I think that the great challenge is still, we have automatic captions whenever we have Teams or a Zoom. They are not, as they are machines, they are not like here when we have persons who are with critical sense writing things. So I think I know it's not the same. It's it helps, but it's not a perfect. But we have great difficulties, as you well know, with sign languages because it's a quite dear service, and we don't have budget for that. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. I mean, it's really important, and we are not getting how to do that. Another thing is the documents, because for the documents, I think we try to use accessible formats, but the big problem is the final published version. And but things are moving on. For example, in Etsy, the STF is trying to do things more usable. They're starting to think about if the document could be not a PDF, but something else. So with all this debate, things are moving on, I think.
Yes, and like 1 billion% faster than Etsy. The Canadian Standardization Organization has already published the EN in HTML, so that was not that difficult. And now it's unfortunately unpublished again because the public consultation is out, but it will be published again. So Europe is standing still, but the Canadians are showing us leading the way with our own standard. It's a bit embarrassing, but at least we will have it in HTML.
Of course, yes, I fully agree with you. So, any more feedback?
And, yeah, may I one more comment? I do miss one choice, and that's time, because you have to have some time to be involved in the standardization, and that's not just about money to hire someone, but also about the lack of skilled persons with broad knowledge. Mm-hmm. So that's also, from my point of view, that's a crucial point.
Yeah, thank you. This is Pau. I come from academia and research. So when we're discussing this, it looks, obvious to me, but I think it must be mentioned that it's not only important to ensure accessibility for meetings about standardization, but we must think as well about the accessibility to just become an expert for people with disabilities, for instance. So I was reviewing the data for Spain, right? I'm based in a Spanish university in Barcelona, the UOC. 280 times more people without a disability gain a PhD than people with disabilities in Spain, according to the INE, the Spanish National Institute, last year, right? So if the full implications of what we're facing sink in, we start realizing how important it is to really, really set the stage so that the people that are actually in line with becoming experts and do have a disability or have access to the perspective of people with disabilities do actually get access to it. Because there is this, it's a cross-sectional issue. And I just wanted to mention it because sometimes we kind of lose track of the basic social issue that we're facing, which I think is much more challenging in the end. Thank you.
Any more feedback on this? If not, we can move to the recommendations. We have pre-written some recommendations. My chair has fallen down. But we want to share with you and to check, and as we share in the screen, we can, if needed, amend it and complement with what we are saying. But let's share our proposal as a recommendation for the public authorities. Ivana, let's go first. There are 2 blocks, one for legislation and another for standardization.
And I mean, this is, as Fernando said, it's something that is mainly as a suggestion. We would be more than happy to hear your feedback and to update them, which is why we also have a reporter in the room. So in terms of the ones that are related to legislation, they are built on 3 specific points that are very much tackling in the way the presentation was done. And it's mainly related to how do we foresee this process specifically related to the transposition at the national level. So we encourage public authorities to involve civil society organization in the monitoring of the implementation of their accessibility legislation, including via periodic reviews, which basically refers both to the involvement and something that we said is also a key factor for success of the involvement of the civil society stakeholders, but not only in the creation of such and implementation of such legislation, but also within the reviews. The second one refers more to the support, the implementation of peer learning activities across countries to improve the design and impact of accessibility laws and policies. As we could just see today from this very small session where we, with the presence of representatives of few countries and few different stakeholders, it's already a forum for us to share and to learn. We want to see something like that expanded to a much larger level, and support for something like that should exist by public authorities, both at the European but as well as the national level. And third, support the upskilling and reskilling of the workforce towards having more knowledge of accessibility, resulting in a more inclusive society. And here we think about the workforce in every aspect, from workforce or people who are working within public authorities to particularly workforce in the economic sphere, like banking, companies, design agencies, anyone who is working on designing any sort of product or service, especially within an area that has been seen as historically inaccessible. I think it's very important to work on providing the learning possibilities and training opportunities for their staff. This is something that we do a lot with our organizations, where we offer this type of trainings, and it can be just an accessibility for starting from accessibility of HR and employment in companies up to how to actually drive and design accessible products and services. So these 3 recommendations, basically, one referring to the participation of civil society in the implementation and the periodic reviews. Second one referring to the peer learning and sharing of practices on the impact of accessibility and policies. And third one about the learning of the workforce and improvement of knowledge in order to design more inclusive societies. So I'm opening the floor for some feedback from everyone present, and both in terms of if you have anything to add, maybe something to change within what is proposed, or add something completely new. Please take the floor. Yes, please go ahead.
This is Bianca. I do have one point, and that's based on, and I hope it can be somewhere fixed in standardization or in future reviews of the legislation. Because what I noticed, and that's quite a big barrier is that some countries use the opportunity for the economic burden to train staff on accessibility. And for example, in the Netherlands, it is actually in the interpretation of the EAA, while educating staff on the application of accessibility is crucial to really deploy accessibility, because we have businesses with champions. And what we found with champions, it's a really nice approach to create awareness, but it does not work to really implement and make sure. Because if you only have a small group of UX designers and you have like 20 people trained, but you have 500 UX designers in your business, you cannot apply, and the few are overworked, and they actually cannot do what they should do. And the same part is for developers. And this also applies on the very simple things like communications, how to make your documents accessible. And this training part, the burden, the economic burden, I think that's a huge barrier, which a lot of businesses are going to use and say, this is expensive. And yes, it's expensive, but in the end, it will save a lot of money. And that's not clear for most businesses.
Thank you. I mean, this is something that kind of is already included within the upskilling and reskilling of the workforce. Perhaps we can add, as at the end of this sentence, support the upskilling and reskilling of the workforce towards having more knowledge of accessibility. It is including focusing on variety of operations within the economic sectors and a larger amount and bigger amount of workforce in order to result in more inclusive society. So we can add maybe a few sentences to specify that it should be more related to a rather the entire workforce and not focusing on champions, as you mentioned, or on a smaller amount of people who are trained and can be resources for others. Indeed, I think what we initially meant is really to have the entire workforce trained, not necessarily just some part of it, but we can specify that for sure and add it.
Yeah, and if you need any feedback, let me know.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please.
I have more general question. So requirements in the directive are minimum requirements, and they are compulsory, and the standards are voluntary, and the countries, as I understood right, are encouraged to take even stricter approach and make the requirements even stricter. But when the main goal of European Accessibility Act is to make to open the market for a free movement of accessible products and services. So how can this be combined? Let's say if one country chooses to do a very strict accessibility requirements and another one is staying on the minimum requirements. So how is the movement of goods and services in this case?
I understand that you refer to this clause where it says that member states are encouraged to have more. Right? I don't know if it says encourage or allow, but I think it says encourage to have more demanding requirements. Yes, for me that's against the main purpose, which is allowing this free movement of products and services within the EU. For me, I think that from my side, standards are a great tool for that. Because if you have a standard that's saying that fulfilling the standard, you're fulfilling the directive, and if there's any national difference where this is not compatible, you need to have a clear statement in the standard saying, in this country, this clause cannot be applied because there's a different and a conflicting legal requirement. So that's a great tool because at least you know that everything works in all the EU countries, but for those specific clauses in these countries, and you know that in advance, you have to fulfill some different requirements due to the national legislation. So I think that that's a great tool for that.
And If I may add, there is also the act by itself is encouraging as well harmonization, which, I mean, this is also one of the critiques a bit on certain requirements within the act, that they are not strong enough, also in order to make them as minimal requirements. So it's rather I mean, in addition to that, I think there is a support from the Commission and the working group there is on the implementation of the Act in terms of this sort of harmonization and allowing member states to exchange a bit on the practices, so to say. But obviously, I think with having the standards that is helping more, but also keep in mind that, I mean, we haven't really heard of a story that this has become problematic, but usually it's the case that the issue is that there is really the adoption of rather lower requirements than something that is higher. I think this is what have shown what we have seen so far in the practice of development of the different measures within the EU member states. Okay, final round of comments related to the 3 recommendations. So one is involvement of civil society in the monitoring and the implementation of accessibility legislation. The second one is the support of sharing learning across the countries related to accessibility laws. And third one on the upskilling and reskilling of workforce towards more knowledge on accessibility. Anything you want to add, take away, add a point that is missing? As there are no reactions, then I suggest we go to the second slide with the second part of recommendations.
This recommendation would be not only for public authorities, but also for standards organizations, because they play a key role there. So our first proposal will be for public authorities to reference key accessibility standards in legislation, because I think that's a key driver for making the fulfillment of standards compulsory. I mean, and some examples. For example, we have in Spain, we have standards for plain language. For example, well, not plain language, easy to read language. And I'm sure that many of you have also done it like that. For accessibility of the cultural heritage, for many things that are not in this plan of the European Commission of harmonized standards, but that might play a big role defining specific requirements. Okay. The other one will be to involve organizations of persons with disabilities and organizations of older persons, in the development of European accessibility standards. I think that we all have agreed that one of the main stakeholder that needs to be involved in the development of accessibility standards are these collectives, the persons with disabilities and older persons. And the third point will be to enhance the participation at national level as the most effective way to build alliances with national stakeholders and overcome language barriers and travel costs. So I don't know if you find these proposals acceptable, sufficient, if you disagree with any of those statements, if you would like to complement or to add something that is not written here. Let me repeat them again. To reference key accessibility standards in legislation, to involve organizations of persons with disabilities and organizations of older persons in the development of European accessibility standards, and to enhance the participation at national level as the most effective way to build alliances with national stakeholders and overcome language barriers and travel costs. Sadi.
Fernando, does the terms involve organizations and enhance participation? Are you envisioning here some form of training or capacity building to help people with disabilities who are often non-technical to actually navigate their way through? We already saw quite some acronyms and some of the practices. Standards organizations are not easy. So I think there's an active part. It's not just, opening the door. It's really, helping how to be involved, be active in disability in standardization.
I think that we could add a point on that. We are doing things on that at the Accessible EU level. We are participating in workshops with ANEC. We are participating in lots of workshops with the EDF, especially on that. And not only open workshops, we are also having private meetings with EDF members. Also, up to this moment, they were on the general points on Accessible EU, but we have a specific point for this year in mind to help them to involve here.
Yes, that's really great. But I think beyond Accessible EU, the question here is on public authorities and standards bodies. They also have a role to play and responsibility. And maybe, it's a multiplier effect. Accessible EU, if they can help standards organizations be more accessible and be more open to disability organizations, that will have a more longer term effect.
So maybe we could at that point say something like to stress the need of training and training on the participation on standardization for persons with disabilities. And I would add, and to cut on them to check their needs, because we need to check which are the barriers. Would that be okay? Any more comment on the or any other suggestion? So we will add a point saying something like the need to train persons with disabilities to participate in standardization and check with them if they have any if they experience any barriers to participate in standardization. Okay.
Okay, so with that, I guess we can close the recommendation. We are almost at the time to close our workshop as well. So I guess with that, we will just update both sets of recommendations, and they will be included in what is the final outcome, not only of this workshop, but also in the final conference, and they will be further considered as well when moving forward with the implementation of the Accessible EU project, particularly on these two items. So thank you very much for the participation and actually giving us your feedback and inputs in how we can move forward with the implementation of this project.
So thanks a lot. For those of you who haven't registered, please do it also online. and thanks a lot for your feedback, your participation. See you.
Thank you very much and see you.